The first portion was supposed to be a workshop looking at ticks, explaining life cycles, etc. What I do have available here, and I will pass these around, the large tube with the orange top are adult Ixodes damani ticks. You can see the female with the reddish color, the male totally black. And the smaller of the two vials are nymphal ticks. So you get the idea of relative size. I'll pass these around. The first speaker of the afternoon is Dr. Bob McLean. He is from the Centers for Disease Control in Fort Collins. He is a vertebrate ecologist who has been with the CDC for a while, initially working with arboviruses. When they reorganized and formed a Lyme disease unit, they had wisdom enough to pull him into this unit, and he has been working with Lyme disease for about the last 3 years. He is from the agency that does not do research on Lyme disease, but he will be talking to us today about the research he's done in Westchester County. So I will pass these ticks around. Harry took it home. It's his.
Good afternoon. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and support the foundation in its efforts in education on Lyme disease, and we certainly appreciate the efforts of the congressman also in supporting not only programs to help you as well as programs that help our research. We do research in Lyme disease, and we want to talk about a little bit about some of those studies this afternoon. First, I'd like to talk about some of our ecological studies that were conducted in Westchester County, New York, in a very hyper-endemic area of Westchester near Armonk, and also later we did study in Chappaqua as well, and talk about some of the patterns we discovered about where the greatest risk of homeowners have in acquiring the infected ticks. In other words, where ticks are located actually in the residential community itself. Second, I'd like to talk a little bit about some studies that were done there to reemphasize that there are intervention strategies available and that do work, and we'll show some data from Westchester County. And third, and most important, I'd like to stress personal protection measures that you as individuals or as homeowners can do to reduce your risk of acquiring Lyme disease. Some of them have already been mentioned, but we'll reemphasize and stress some of those measures. First of all, our studies in Westchester County, New York. This was a cooperative study conducted with the New York Medical College, laboratory of Dr. Derlin Fish, and he conducted many phases of the project. We had several phases conducted by individuals and groups from our laboratory in Colorado, the Division of Vector-Borne Infectious Diseases. Dr. Peisman did the tick ecology stuff that I'll talk about and present some of their data. And my group was involved in doing the studies on the mammals. I will mention a little bit of Dr. Fish's information they acquired on the birds in the same community. This is a community in Armonk, New York, a very hyper-endemic area. This picture was taken by Dr. Fish in the wintertime, and you can see that it's a wooded community. It was bordered on the one side by a freeway, and this road that you can see going around at an angle is the other border of the study area. Residential community of over 100 properties, 100 residences, and we surveyed either about 2/3 of the actual properties were surveyed in one form or another. This is the typical house there with a maintained yard. Not expensive homes in this area, but the land is expensive, as you know, here in Shelter Island. So they are expensive houses. This is the front yard with maintained, and then you see in the backyard Many of the properties have a maintained backyard that abuts up against a wooded area, whether it's on the side or in the backyard. So frequently have woods associated with the larger properties. And many of them will have ornamental plantings, which we'll talk a little bit about later. When you see in the data, the ornamental, that refers to plants that are planted either in islands out in the yard or extensions from the backyard, from the woods. So a lot of ornamental plantings as you have here. Most of this area, the houses were fairly recently built, and they were built in wooded areas. They carved out their yard in the wooded area, and most of the backyards look like this. There's woods immediately behind the house. And most of the homeowners wanted to retain some of the natural setting, the natural woods, and we'll explain in a minute what problem that has presented. This was the community as it mapped out. The shaded areas are the areas where tick study was done, and we did mammal studies intensely in about 8 of these properties and sampled about 8 other properties less intensely. The bird studies were more throughout the community. The tick study was done in all the habitats within that community, and they were all sampled by using this drag. And this is collecting the off-host tick or the free-ranging tick that's questing, that's up on vegetation looking for a ride, a host to come along. And of course you pick it up using this drag. And they were dragged systematically so that over a certain number of meters, they would stop and then retrieve the ticks from the drag. So it was done in a systematic and regular fashion to get some quantitative data. We set a number of small mammal traps. These were live traps to capture things from mice up to raccoon size throughout this community as well. And then once we captured the animal, we removed any attached or on-host ticks from them, and these were identified and checked for the spirochete. So we're getting free-ranging ticks as well as ticks that are already attached to various hosts. In the bird study, there was 2 phases. This was done, again, by Dr. Fisher's group. First, actually set up nets to capture the birds, and the birds were examined and ticks removed, as well as the circles there were areas where they did observations and tried to estimate the abundance of birds, what species of birds were in the community and relative numbers of various species of birds. The data acquired on the ticks kind of matches some of the data you've already seen in other areas, and it does match the data in Connecticut and the data in Massachusetts, and as I mentioned in New Jersey. So a very seasonal pattern in the activity of the various stages of the tick. This is the tick data. The adults with a bimodal peak, the nymphs occurring about this time of the year in their peak activity, and the larvae a little bit later. So the data there kind of supported, and this seems to be a similar pattern throughout northeastern United States. I was just recently in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they have quite different pattern there. Not sure the reasons for their pattern, whether it's weather, vegetation, the animal host, but they do have a different pattern there. It doesn't seem to have these very definite peaks. It seems to be more spread out throughout the year. So you can get all stages at a particular time on animals particularly. This is the results from the tick study. This is the total ticks collected. The 4 habitats that they classified, that they sampled, were lawn, the ornamental plantings, the ecotone, or the edge between the yard and the woods, and the woods. And you can see they sampled about 67 of the 100 properties, finding a number of ticks on these various habitats. As you can see in the last column there, the ticks per square meter, that it certainly varied from one type of habitat to another, and we'll see some more data on that for the particular stages of tick. First, the larval abundance in the residential community. You can see more larvae were collected in the woods than any other habitat type, less in the edge and ornamental, and no larvae were actually collected from the maintained lawn. And most of these lawns were kept very close, short grass. They were not allowed to grow very high, and so the higher the grass, the higher humidity, and the greater chance of ticks surviving there. So these were well-maintained yards. but no larvae in the lawn. We can see also with the nymphal tick that, again, the woods, there are many more nymphal ticks in the woods, proportionally more along the edge than we saw with larvae and less in the ornamental plants, and there were some nymphal ticks in the lawn. Now, this has some risk, as you can imagine, because the nymphal tick is the one responsible for most human transmission. So right in people's lawns, there can be a risk of transmission. So the better kept the lawn, be better to reduce the risk of picking up a nymphal tick. But again, greater in the woods than any other habitat type. Then the adult tick, again, was not found on the lawns. Very few, I think there's one or something that was found on the lawn, but most of it in the woods. And the adult ticks were along the edge as well. So in the fall, this was done in the fall, that the adult ticks do come up to the edge of the yard, so they're very close to the yard as well as in the woods. Now, if we can look at the infection rate in the ticks, it didn't seem to matter where the ticks were. Wherever they were collected, they were infected. This is infection rate in the nymphal ticks. Looks like the lawn had a higher infection rate, but there were very few ticks, if you remember, collected in the lawn. But they had fairly high infection rate. Most studies that Dr. Fish has done there, they varies from about 20 to 30% of the nymphal ticks are infected. Now, if you remember from some of the discussions earlier that the nymphal tick has only had one chance of feeding. It fed as a larvae on a mouse or whatever, so it's only had one chance of becoming infected. And so about 20 to 30% of those in this community did acquire the infection, and they can transmit it on. And if we look, so the average percent is about 30% there that they found of these ticks that were collected in people's yards. If we look at the adult tick, and as has been found elsewhere, as was mentioned this morning, some areas here in Long Island may get up to 100% of the adult ticks infected, but there the average was about 50%. And this is probably generally over a large area. This is the percentage you'll find infected, about 50%. But you will have local spots where the infection rate can get higher. So there, again, it didn't matter too much where the ticks were found, that many of them were infected. At least half were infected with the spirochete. If we go on and look at the mammals that were captured there, this is the relative capture rate for various mammal species. And as has been found elsewhere, the mouse is the white-footed mouse. That was the only mouse we found there. It made up about 50% of all of our captures of animals. Out in the coastal plain region, particularly the work that's been done in Massachusetts, they found a much higher proportion. And in Long Island, you'd probably have that as well. The mammals that might be captured in that setting, you'd probably get 70% maybe the Peromyscus mouse, the white-footed mouse. But in this particular environment, we have a more diverse mammal fauna, so we have many other species that are involved in the community as well as involved in hosting the ticks. The mouse is followed by the eastern gray squirrel, very common in many communities, the raccoon, the chipmunk, and opossum, and a few other species that we found in that community. One species that we did not sample very adequately, and that was rabbits. We didn't have the proper capture techniques for rabbits, and rabbits are very common in that community as they are here. They have been involved some in hosting the ticks and in transmission cycles. Been one cycle identified that they actually have their own transmission cycle and their own ticks, and that occasionally gets connected to the other transmission cycle with Damini. They have Ixodes dentatus and have their own tick transmission cycle. So we underrepresented rabbits in our data, obviously. If we look at the distribution of where the mammals were found, of our 8 sites that we sampled intensely, you can see that the tree squirrel was found everywhere, no matter where we sampled. That was followed by the white-footed mouse, the shrew, and raccoon, and decreasing down to something like the meadow vole, which is found only in grassy, high grass shrub areas. We did have some of that in the community, so we did collect some meadow voles, but again, by far, the tree squirrel and the white-footed mouse were the most common rodents found throughout the community. Looking at where we found the animals, this is percent of the mammal, of all those mammal species. You can see more of them were found along the edges and in woods than actually in the yards themselves. There were about 60% of the species in the yards, and this was mostly the tree squirrel, the raccoon, and opossum. Rarely did we capture the white-footed mouse actually out in the maintained yard. They need some shelter. They will not venture out unless they have some shelter, some cover, and so you won't usually find the white-footed mouse out in the yard. The exception to that might be in the fall when, as winter is approaching, they will seek shelter and will sometimes go into buildings to spend the winter. So in the fall, they may be coming into the buildings and into the yard, but at that time, they rarely have ticks on them by the time they're going into the buildings. Question? Yeah.
Except for the rabbits, is there a fairly equal distribution of mammal captures?
No, it's not, equal distribution. You mean among the sites or within a site as far as the habitat?
Like the slide before this,
Right.
you got most of your ticks from mice and squirrels and raccoons, but the number of mammals that you've actually captured,
Right.
is that equally distributed?
Fairly equal, yeah. They're fairly widely distributed in the community. Well, communities like this have,
But it was a capture.
right. And I've seen what you're saying. If you're in a wooded area, then you have fairly even capture of mice or raccoons. If you're getting into yards, you're not going to have an equal distribution, mainly because of protection. Animals do like to go along like a wall, and this area has a lot of stone walls left over from the farming region or farming time in the late 1800s. They use stone as their fences, and so this community still has a lot of these stone fences. So if those extend out into the yards, then the animals will venture along those stone walls. So there are a lot of other landscape features that are conducive to where the animals are found. But in the woods, it generally, similar pattern if you're in a wooded area. Looking at the ticks on these mammals, shows first column the species and then the number that were examined and percent with ticks. And you can see most of the animals had ticks on them. The one exception I have in bold there is a short-tailed shrew. They probably are equally have a similar prevalence of infestation, but they're usually dead. Unfortunately, they have very high metabolism, so you come back in the morning to check the trap, and these animals are dead and cold, and the ticks may have left them by the time we examine them. So we're probably underrepresenting them as far as their tick prevalence. But you can see most of them have ticks on them, and many of them are Ixodes damini, like the white-footed mouse. 88% of them had Ixodes damini on them. And it drops down. The raccoon is one that's a little bit less. There's a disparity between percent of ticks and percent with damini, and this is because many of the ticks were the American dog tick that was on the raccoon. We'll see that a little bit later. If we look at we call the tick loads, or the number of ticks actually on the animal, that was presented this morning in the New Jersey stuff. You saw how many ticks were on a particular animal. And this is both larvae and nymphs combined. They're not separated here. So you can see the white-footed mouse is important, an average of almost 7 ticks per mouse with a range of 1 to 42. And various other species are equally involved. So it's not just one species in this particular area we have to worry about. There are a number of other species have ticks on them. The question is, are they also infected with the spirochete, and can they pass that infection on to the ticks? And that's called the reservoir competence of the particular vertebrate host, and we don't know that for all the species. We do know that the eastern chipmunk and the white-footed mouse for sure are very good hosts. Some of the others we're not as sure about. There are studies in progress to evaluate their competence. I know Dr. Bosler, I think, is working on the raccoon, and I know other people are working on other species to look at their competence as a good reservoir for the spirochete. We also see seasonal differences, and we've sampled a very narrow window, so we're probably talking in June that these ticks are almost all nymphs, and in August they're almost all larvae. There were a few exceptions, but generally that's what we're seeing here. Again, you can see some patterns where many of the species are involved in having ticks on them. You're going to have more larvae in August, obviously, than you're going to have nymphs in June on a particular animal. Some of the animals, this data represents actually how many ticks were on them. For instance, a white-footed mouse, it's fairly easy to search a white-footed mouse and get almost all the ticks off that are on it. But an animal like a raccoon, it's very difficult to remove all the ticks that are on them, to even find them. People that have done more thorough studies, they'll keep the captured animal for several days, hold it over water, and let all the ticks drop off that are on it. And what they found is a species like raccoon that probably 10 times more than we can examine and find were actually on the raccoon. So this data probably would be 40 for raccoons rather than 4.3 if we actually held them and let all the ticks drop off. So it varies with the type of species and how well you can examine them. We didn't handle the animals for very long. We wanted to return them to where we captured them, so we didn't keep them very long to do a thorough evaluation of their tick loads. These are the species of ticks that we did find on the animals, and again, 90% of them were the deer tick, Ixodes damani, but there were other species present. Ixodes texanus is primarily a raccoon tick, and most of those were collected off the raccoons that we captured. Ixodes cookii is mostly on the woodchuck or the groundhog. We did capture a few of those. That tick will occasionally feed on people and has been reported to transmit Lyme disease, but it's not very, first of all, the tick is not very common and rarely does it feed on people, so it's not a great risk. And a number of other species, the American dog tick, the last one there, Dermacentor variabilis, and as I said earlier, most of those were on raccoons. They are common, but used to be the most common tick here in the east, and everyone worried about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and it's certainly been replaced now by the Ixodes damani as the most frequent tick found on mammals. As far as the bird studies, as was a study conducted in Connecticut by Dr. Anderson and Magnarelli, they did find birds are reservoir competent, which means that they can pass the spirochete on to any ticks that are feeding on them. And the American robin was a common bird in this community. If we look at this data, just look at the first part of it. The first column over there is a bird species. The second column is this density estimate, or how many birds were in each of those observation circles, and the third column is the ticks that were found on the birds. The first bird there, the AMRO, is the American robin, and you can see that they first were the most abundant bird in the community, as well as they had a lot of ticks on them. These are Ixodes damani on birds, so that American robin contributes, at least in this community, that may not be true elsewhere, but at least in this community are intimately involved in hosting the tick. What we need to determine is, are they also involved in transmission of the spirochete? Second on that list is a common grackle, or the blackbird, as many people call it. That's very commonly feeding in yards. And then third is the house wren. It's also not nearly as abundant, but did have many ticks on it. And then there's blue jay and song sparrow and other species as you go down the list. But birds are important, and we need to resolve their contribution to overall Lyme transmission. We don't know it very well at this point, so if we're doing any control programs, in the future we certainly need to look at birds as a possibility. Well, as I mentioned, I wanted to re-emphasize what was already talked about as far as insecticides. Dr. Fish did conduct a study in Westchester County using the EPA-approved insecticides for tick control. And he used commercial pest control operators to apply it. And as I mentioned here, they did use liquid application. They didn't use the granular formulation that was mentioned this morning. So they did use commercial operators who treated yards, and they had control yards and experimental yards. They collected ticks beforehand, sprayed the yards, and then collected ticks afterwards. And these were aimed at the nymphal tick, so it was done in June. the first part of June, trying to evaluate the effect on the nymphal stage of the tick. And you can see similar results that were mentioned this morning, fairly good control with several of the insecticides. You can see carbaryl here wasn't as good a control as was mentioned this morning, but want to remember this was a liquid application, was not the granular formulation mentioned this morning. But so this is a tool, and that's all we talk about. We're trying to make available a potpourri of control techniques that are available, and so this is one that would be available if somebody wanted to use it. And so we can say in this residential community, by treating the yards, they can greatly reduce the number of nymphal ticks. And finally, I want to move on to stress personal protection. The first part of it is certainly what you're doing here, and that's education, and that's very, very important. And without the education, the rest would not be very useful. You just had a chance to look at some of the ticks, but just being aware of what the tick, first what a tick is. Many people turn in pieces of skin, think, I was bitten by a tick, and they've pulled off a freckle and sent it in. So just being aware of what a tick is very important. Being aware of which tick it is also very crucial. You need to know, is it the deer tick or is it the American dog tick? So very important for people to be aware of what species of ticks they have been exposed to. Second is location of the tick habitats, and that was shown this morning and by our previous data just presented to know where the ticks are. The ticks are mostly in the wooded areas, and need to know which wooded areas. So this information can be acquired either through seminars like this or from your local health department to know which habitats have the greatest risk, because they're going to be different, as you'll see in a minute. They're going to be different in New Jersey than they are in Westchester County as they are here in Shelter Island. So the habitats may be quite different for your particular locality. And also aware of the tick seasonal activity to know when the highest risk of acquiring a tick is, and you saw that in some of the information here today, that when the tick is active and when you need to be more cautious than other times of the year. And finally, knowledge of the Lyme disease symptoms, and that was certainly presented very well this morning, that find out what the symptoms are. You need to be aware of that as well as a physician so that you can work with a physician to get early treatment, and early treatment is really important, as was mentioned this morning. So knowledge of the symptoms and your exposure risk is very important. So these are, before we do anything else, this education is very important. Well, what are some things that can be done to modify your personal habits to reduce your risk? And many of these have been mentioned by the foundation and by other people, and I just made a list of them here. And of course, what was shown, the picture of somebody wearing the appropriate clothing, this picture of that this morning. You have a long sleeve shirt, long pants, and tuck your pant legs into socks, and some people have even suggested taping for instance, the top of your sock, or taping any other opening that the ticks can get in, if you want to go to those extremes. But the more, the better. In this case, you will reduce your risk. Wearing light-colored clothing, that allows you to see the tick as it's crawling up your pants. If you're wearing dark clothing, as you can see the color of the tick, you would have more difficult time seeing it. So that just gives you a longer period of time to observe the tick. Avoid walking in areas where there are tick infestations. And that would be in wooded areas, as we've shown, even in your own yards, in brush and tall grass during the tick season. So if you want to go to the extreme, you would just avoid those areas. And finally, with the clothing, spraying a repellent on the clothing. And I want to reemphasize what the Congressman mentioned this morning. He's been very instrumental in trying to get this product approved in New York. It is approved in Connecticut and I believe in New Jersey. It's a product containing permethrin that you treat your clothing with. The Army has used it successfully for a number of years. This is a very good product. I'm not trying to sell this particular product, but just this technique where you spray your clothing, and this will last 3 or 4 or 5 washings of your clothing, and the label says it'll last for 2 weeks. Now, I'm sure it lasts longer than that, but just to be safe, you should spray your clothing every 2 weeks with it. You do not put it on your skin. It's just to spray the clothing. But it's a very good product, and the congressman has been working now with the state of New York trying to get it approved here, and hopefully it will be approved in the near future. It has been approved nationwide now by the EPA, so it's no longer just a limited license. There is a general license throughout the country now. So it's a very good product that you can treat your clothing with. There's also a product containing DEET to treat clothing, but as he also mentioned this morning, there's another product does contain DEET. It's 30% DEET, and it's available here right on the island at Bliss Drugstore. It's called Ultrathon, and it contains DEET at 30%, and it's in a cream that has a product in it to make it last longer. If you've ever used the sprays produced by Johnson, they don't last very long. They evaporate very quickly, so you have to constantly keep treating yourself, whereas this is in cream form that'll last much longer. So this is available currently in New York and right here on the island.
Mr. Commissioner, is that on my feet? Can you use that on children?
As long as it's on clothing. What is recommended is you spray your clothing off, not while it's on you. What I do is I'll take my field pants, I'll spray it all, and actually I'll put it, and this is what the Army does, you put it in a plastic bag overnight, and so it'll really impregnate the clothing. Then I hang it out to dry, actually, before I wear it, so it's not wet with the chemical at all. So the clothing's actually dry before you put it on. And question?
The New York State Health Department warning about not putting more than 20% DEET on skin surface.
The problem with the 20% is not effective. You need 30 to 45% to be effective.
Yeah, but they say you can use higher percentage, but don't put it on your skin.
No, I'm saying even on the skin, you need the higher percentage. That's the problem. The 30% in this is right down at the lower limit for being effective. So if you drop below 30%, it's probably not going to be effective. That's the problem. The spray DEET contain like 100%, and that's not good. That's probably too much.
The State Health Department has issued a recommendation.
Oh, have they?
on this. Yeah, that's what you're querying.
Yeah.
They recommended 30% or lower, not applied to the skin. However, it is acceptable for skin in adults. We've had some problems in pediatric cases. The name of the syndrome escapes me. It's some neurological syndrome, and it's almost immediate after application of DEET to the skin. It's in very short order. And this is in the pediatric population, what is it, 2, 3, 4, maybe years old. So as you get older, it doesn't seem to be as important. But that's just a cautionary, release from the State Health Department to alert people of the fact that this does occur. And they're recommending 30%
They
or lower.
their recommendation is composite is 20%.
So I don't know. The last one I had is 30%.
If this is 30%, so that must be the upper limit, I think.
I don't think that 20% is even available. I used to work for Johnson, and as Cutterwood up there, active ingredient, we'd up ours at 10%. And that's how the product game went. And when I left, we were up about 29.8%.
A lot of products are only 19%. Certain campus color, I think, really nice.
Hmm.
It depends what formulation also. The liquids are higher concentration. So I don't know. I'll check on that. Last I heard was 30%.
This is 31.58%, it says in, so that must be right at the upper limit, I think. Yeah, some of the sprays got up to approaching 100% there for a while. The Deep Woods, I think, was close approaching 100%. But the problem with the sprays is they do evaporate fairly quickly, and this has an advantage that will last longer. This is what the Army does use, the same product or similar product so you treat your clothing with the spray, and at least the Army does, they treat your skin with this DEET product. And so the combination they feel, gives 97 to 98% protection to the troops. So can be very effective if used. Another important measure is not only for your safety, but for your pet safety, is try to keep them out of the infested areas. Don't let them wander back in the woods on their own. If you can at all possible, keep them out of the infested areas. They can bring the ticks that are crawling on them back to the yard, and they can crawl off and possibly even in the house and expose you that way. So not only if they do go out in those areas, is try to inspect them right away as soon as they return, so to remove any ticks that are on your pets. If you're out in the area and once you return, you remove and wash your clothing very promptly. And one of the important things is to use a good strong detergent and possibly to dry it in a hot dryer, because this can kill the ticks if you dry the clothes in a very hot dryer. And finally, to inspect yourself and remove any ticks that are on you as soon as you return from the backyard or out hiking or whatever, is to promptly inspect yourself for ticks. As was mentioned, it takes a little bit of time for the tick to transmit, so the sooner you can get the tick off, the better chances you have of not acquiring the disease. So the more rapid examination and removal of the ticks, the better you are. You're not going to guarantee that it hasn't been on long enough, but you're going to greatly reduce your chances if you find them and remove them quickly. Question? Yeah.
I recommend I change my old feeders down in the fall in the weather. I keep them comfortable, and I really don't see anything except for the head, which you can't shave.
Right.
The whole body is exposed, all the skin color, and I should keep on anything. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, it's
It's not recommended for those that are old, traumatized, that young people, understand it.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Yeah. Thank you, that's a good idea. And then some things that the homeowner can actually do themselves, either in changing their activity patterns or their modifying the yards. I showed you pictures of the ornamental shrubs and plants there as a reducer. Change this type of shrubs so that they're not attractive to deer. People in Westchester love to plant rhododendrons, and deer love rhododendrons, and so they're actually attracting deer right to the yard by providing this good food. The problem is as the deer population gets larger, then they're hungrier because there's less food available, and they're going to start feeding on anything. So if you have a large population, it probably doesn't make any difference. But you do want to try to reduce the attraction of the deer right to your yard if you can. Another good thing would be this edge. As I showed, the woods is the area of greatest risk. The edge is also an area of risk, so if you can reduce the brush and rock and debris right at the edge of the yard and woods that make this a zone, a modified zone, you can reduce the ticks right at the edge of your yard. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Also, if you're doing yard work, is regularly wear this treated clothing that we just mentioned when doing your yard work, or if your kids are playing in the yard. If you can have a set of clothing that you do yard work with, that you hang up when you're ready to come inside, and use those same clothes for a week or 2 weeks after you've treated them, this will greatly improve your protection against ticks, so that this treated with this spray and use those same clothes to do yard work, it can reduce your risk. If you want to go to some extremes, keep deer out of your yard. Certainly it's been shown you can put up these exclusion fences, very high fences, and put that around your property. There aren't many people who are going to go to the expense of that. You'd have to be pretty desperate, I think, to use exclusion fences, but people in the project here in Shelter Island, they are going to look at repellents, chemical repellents, to try to keep deer out of yards. And so there is some research being conducted to reduce the deer use of residential yards. And finally, even more extreme, if you want to do this, is remove all the shrubs, the sapling, the logs, and the litter from the woods, so you can kind of create a park-like woods. I'll show you a picture of that. First, like in the backyard, as I remember, this edge right along the woods. So what you want to do there is make that very clean right along the edge. So maybe a back a yard or 2 yards into the woods, and make that a very clean area, no brush, no shrubs, no debris along that edge. And so you're not going to have, while you're doing the yard work, then you're going to have a larger zone between you and where the ticks are if you do make a good modified edge. This is what the woods looks like in Westchester County, and if you remember the slide this morning of the woods in New Jersey, they're quite different. We have quite a more deciduous forest in Westchester County, more open woods, don't have as thick underbrush as you might have out here in Long Island or in New Jersey in the coastal plain region. And this is very typical of the woods in Westchester County. So if you wanted to modify that woods, what would you do to reduce your risk of having ticks? And we can see that this is what you could do, as Dr. Schultze mentioned this morning. If you want to go to this extreme, of course, you're going to have to maintain that grass. You get rid of all the logs, all the leaf litter, all the shrubs, and you're probably not going to have many ticks in a setting like that. But most people moved into these residential communities to have the natural setting. I don't think there are many people going to go to this extreme. This would certainly work, but be costly and difficult to maintain. But that is an approach besides the insecticides or some of the other approaches. That's all I have, unless there's some questions. Yes. Oh.
Recently, I heard a speaker talk about ivermectin in dogs. For those who don't know, it's a heartworm medication preventive, that once the tick is on the dog and bites the dog, the ivermectin that is circulating in the dog's bloodstream.
Yeah, ivermectin is one, I think the Congressman mentioned this morning. The Army is looking into it, and treating deer actually is what they're interested in. The problem with a dose for treating heartworm is probably not high enough to actually work as an anti-tick repellent. In studies done in animals, you can get rid of ticks that way. It does work. It's one of the side benefits of ivermectin. It's a very good product seen for a lot of things. So it can work, but the problem is that with dogs, they keep them at the very lowest dose level that they can to prevent heartworm infection. So if you got a higher dose, it might work. The problem, there are some species of dogs, for instance, you can't give ivermectin to that are susceptible. The collie group, I think, have problems with ivermectin. So, and the higher doses, they may have some side effects that you'd have to watch. So, yeah, ivermectin is being investigated. The dose for dogs for heartworm is probably not high enough to have anti-tick effect.
I'm sure that I'm a private dog store. You can go there, and there are deer, those massive lawns, and they're deer all over. So, are they just staying on the host, or are they dropping off into the lawn?
The ticks probably do drop off in the lawn. They're just not surviving well in the lawn. So they're probably dropping off from many of the animals out in the lawn, but most of them are not surviving well there. So they're there occasionally, but
When that tick drops off, the tick is on the lawn, how long will it survive?
gee, do you have any data? Be hard to say.
If you're talking in terms of an adult tick, this would happen in the spring. And I would think if you could reach some cover, some sort of survive, if it's out in the middle of the yard, or the golf course, I wouldn't think it would live very long. But,
So if they don't find a host right away, they're done.
well, no, that's because if you're talking in terms of the adult ticks, she will have engorged on blood. Her next mission after she drops from that deer is to lay her eggs and die. So that's it for her. That's what I'm saying. She gets eaten by a predator or dies in the middle of the golf course before she finds cover in leaf litter or something under a log maybe where she can lay eggs. Then she has a chance. But,
And the eggs have a chance. They wouldn't have a very good chance out on the lawn either, the larvae that hatch.
and deer by nature are browsers. They don't always hang out in the woods. They'll come right out and start grazing in the field and below vegetation.
I have a little bit of mine. When I used to jog, and I would kind of feel they would just move up. Now, I'll jog, and I'll just stand there. Now, is that because they're generally diseased, or is that because, is that much change in a few years?
Yeah, they're adjusting to urban, suburban life. Yeah.
25 years, and all of a sudden, they're not moving. And I just thought, oh, they
No, I think they're just adjusted to, people. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's so many of them now. Before, you would see that maybe once, a month or something. Now, there's just so many deer that you're encountering deer more often, and so they're having more encounters with people, so they're adjusting to people being around.
Deer are other wild animals resistant to bacteria?
Well, most of the animals do get infected and, can pass it on to ticks. There's deer, it's been some question about whether they're involved. Some people have said yes, some people no, so that story is still not solved yet with deer. Generally, most people feel they're not involved in amplifying the infection. Other species are.
They don't get ill. They don't
Right.
get lame.
No.
What
No.
role does the tick play in the ecosystem? Every species that does.
Some useful purpose, yeah. We're not sure.
Some of the longtime shelter islanders keep small flocks of guinea hens with the theory that the guinea hens consume a number of ticks. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, they probably do, but as was mentioned this morning, they probably eat a lot of other things too, and it's one of the trade-offs. If you want the noise and the bother of the guinea hens, you're trading that for some effect on the ticks. They probably have some impact, but I don't think really anyone's evaluated how effective they could be. It's one of those things, that can be used like a lot of other things. I really can't, without any research on it, it'd be difficult to comment on how effective they are.
Yeah, a lot of your control methods were based on keeping deer out of the yard. What's the difference with that with white-tailed mouse and things?
Because the deer are the host for the adult tick, and so if there's nothing for the adult tick to feed on, there's some studies were done in some offshore islands in Massachusetts. They found if they eliminated deer, they could reduce the tick population. Apparently, they can't eliminate it because there are alternate hosts like the raccoon and some of the other things, right? So all you're doing is trying to dampen the number of ticks. So by doing some of these management tools, and if we can do them in an integrated fashion where we combine various tools together, and as was mentioned this morning, if you target it at a particular time of the year or a particular stage of the tick or a particular host, and you combine these in an integrated fashion, you're going to have overall a much bigger impact on the tick population, hopefully. And that's what we're trying. We're trying to get individual data on each of these so we can build up a database to know.
What would help keep white-tailed mouse at the
Yeah, there's no question, as I just showed you, they need shelter, and they're found almost exclusively in the woods. I mean, they rarely come out into the yard themselves, and so something else is, if ticks are out in the yard, it's probably something else bringing them into the yard, whether it's birds or rabbits or gray squirrel, tree squirrels, something else is bringing the ticks out into the yard. It's probably not the mouse. But the mouse is not only maintaining the tick, the immature ticks in the woods, it's also maintaining the spirochete. So it's very important for both of those. And in some habitats, as I mentioned, the mouse is much more important out here in Long Island in the coastal plain region than it is in maybe a deciduous forest or other species that are also involved, like chipmunk, tree squirrel, and some of the other species.
It's also a fact that these animals, have that system that basically counteract infected bacteria so that they don't get it from eating them or
I don't know if are you gonna look at that in your study, or?
Not really.
We did a little bit of a cat study. One of the problems that recent times now, it's very difficult to get experimental animals, and we happen to be in Colorado where it's almost impossible to get experimental animals. We have the State Humane Society that's against it, and so it's making it very difficult. So we had a small group of animals, and we did a few actually feeding infected tissue that way. We got serologic conversion, but no disease in the cat. So it's theoretically possible. There have been some studies done in Wisconsin where they looked at alternate routes of transmission, including contact transmission. So I guess it's theoretically possible. It just hasn't been enough thorough research done to evaluate its potential yet. Right. Well, again, it's been some evidence of that, but it hasn't been thoroughly evaluated yet. I think it's still not sure if that's possible yet. We did a study last year in Wisconsin looking at dairy cattle, and we came up just about still unsure whether there's any increased risk of being a dairy farmer to Lyme disease, and we didn't find any, and this was using, unfortunately, the serologic test, as was mentioned this morning, is difficult to use to interpret infection. So, we have problems there of, in diagnosis. So with that problem, we found that there was no greater risk to the dairy farmer himself from handling the cows and everything else. So, I don't think it's ever been isolated from saliva. Do you know?
No, there's some indirect evidence, once again, of being able to infect the mouse by putting the organism in the mouth. And I think there is some indirect evidence of salivary transmission, but that's in a peromyscus in the laboratory and was only done, I think, once. The evidence for any horizontal transmission is indirect and relatively unstable at this point in time. It really has to be evaluated in a good setup. It doesn't mean you can rule it out. Definitely not, because in the mice that we collect on Long Island, I can routinely recover live spirochetes from the urine of these mice, and they are Borrelia burgdorferi. Other people don't seem to be able to duplicate that work. And I think the reason being is we have a multiple infection with Babesia and Lyme disease here. Babesia causes red cells to disrupt, which will shed protein into the urine. And then it also, the same parasite can destroy the basement membrane of the kidney, so the spirochete can pass through in the viable state. And if you consider that this is somewhat related to leptospires, which occur naturally in pastures, things of that nature, in very moist and wet areas. And that organism is transmitted right from the water into other animals. And this occurs in dogs as well. But
dogs are carrying a disease now, which a certain high percentage of stuff they do. Wouldn't they then get the disease from the dog tick, which would become a household problem for that?
for the dog tick,
Dog tick's not very efficient vector.
It's a whole different,
It's been investigated and it'll acquire the spirochete, but apparently it does not pass it on as far as some of the research that's been done. So it's a very inefficient vector. So it'll probably, won't go, through that system. There will be some more information later on dogs, so if you want to keep your questions from that, Dr. Bosler will present a very thorough summary of what's been done in dogs or found in dogs. Well, thank you.
Well, I see we have here scheduled a break, so I guess we take a 15-minute break, and I'll see if I can track down the next speaker and reconvene. I haven't seen him. Yeah, all we've been doing is breaking, eating, and drinking. That's